Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, it's leg day. I forgot how to get down from here. What am I doing? Just do this. Alright, so, last video, we did the Strand Beast setup, which was this one over here. And, it didn't work. It didn't walk well, didn't turn well, didn't do anything particularly well. And not to mention, I couldn't get any frame rate. And a majority of that had to do with the exuberant amount of bearings per leg and the fact we needed 2 of these in each corner to get stability. So, time for some reinvention. That led to me trying to make it smaller and use fewer bearings. That wasn't really working as intended. So that ended up to this kind of design. And this one here, instead of having basically 2 push rods off the crank, one controlling the pitch of the angle of the dangle. Instead of one controlling the pitch of the ankle and one controlling the pitch of the knee, or would that be the knee and the other one the hip? Either way, it just uses one in a slider assembly so that we get that kind of motion. And that started to look pretty good. Now, originally I actually didn't have this hinge on here because, again, I was trying to make it simple. So it would have been 2 bearings and 2 bearings only. And that's this cart here. And this is my my little test bench here. Still on switches because I hadn't figured anything else out, but it kinda sorta works. So here I started working on trying to actually get it to go. And the issue I was having here is, if you look, the amount of time the feet are in the down position making contact with the ground is very slow. The part of the cycle, and that has to do with the fact that this crank comes down when the feet touch. So what happens is the radius between where the crank is and the actual pivot point of the leg is very small. So it kind of was flicking back. The problem is it's spending a lot of time in the air. So this leg here, I think, was the first time where I started experimenting having this crank set up. So right now, if I flick the motor on, it does nothing because the crank is canceling itself out. I have it set to 0, and then I can adjust it to 45 degrees. And when I do that, then it starts the actual walk step. One of the benefits of having the 2 controls there is, if you watch the foot, it actually kind of ramps up its step. It doesn't just immediately snap into a run, it actually kind of slowly goes, and that's because as you hit the button, the radius of the crank is slowly expanding out from 0, because as it's going around, 1 is just starting to kick out. And the cool thing about that is that actually gives us the ability to adjust the step. So if I go to here and I turn the radius of the crank down, it'll actually start to reduce the step. See, now it's a very, very subtle little kind of baby step here. So then we end up with our first kind of setup backwards, but this is where it didn't look great. Because right now it's this one here, it's actually flipped, and that's because if the hinging's going the other way. But it was trying to walk up a wall. It didn't work. So we turned the entire crank system onto its side. Now it looks like we're starting to make progress. So now we can fire up the motor. Turn the motor down a little so you can see what's going on. And holy dear God, progress. So it's a nice long part of the cycle is in its stepping, and then it's very quick in its bringing the foot back to its start position. So now that looks like we're making some progress. And the same thing happens where I can adjust the size of the step just by changing the radius of that crank. Now we can put it to the test, which is this one. So this one has a few more controls because I actually wanted to mess with the ability to change the radius. So you would actually fire up the motors, and then you also have the ability to adjust. You probably can't tell, but if you look at the 4 cranks, you can see they're actually changing position here. If I turn the thing off, And what that does, that actually messes with the timing. So right now, the front and rear legs are in time with their mirror, but not with the front or rear. So the front will go together, the rear will go together. If I change it again, now the left front, the right rear are in time, the right front, the left rear are in time. And then I can fire up my direction, and I do that with 1 or 2, and now I'm gonna go ahead and fire up left and right side. I had them separate because originally I was working on turning, and now you see very smooth. You can, again, the springs are set to 1, so a majority of the vehicle's weight is supported by the legs. The platforms are just there for guidance. And it works-ish. Now, if I wanted to change my running style, I just hit 3, and I go from a walk to a run. And I was happy with that. I thought that worked pretty well. And then I hit 3 again, and now it goes back to a walk. But yeah, so worked pretty well. I need to stop, so I just turned the thing off, and you can see it actually steps into it and then steps out of it. Nice and smooth. I got carried away with the next test platform and started as one of these with just the platforms removed, and then I slowly started adding weight to the front and rear and ended up with that. It's not done. It's definitely a work in progress, but to me the tail's too short, but there's a purpose for it. And then the head's more mouse-ish, but it's the ears. The ears are throwing it off. Nowhere near done, still working on it. The cosmetics are least of the concerns, but the idea is that the head and the tail are actually counterweight. And this very control, good buttons. No, is very controllable. So we've hopped in, and I'm just gonna hit W. 2 controllers fire up on W. One that controls the actual rotation of the main crank, and then one, and that's the one that actually stays put right now. So if you watch the cranks, so one is offsetting the angles between the legs, giving us the odd step, and the other one is offsetting the adjustable radius, giving us the run. Now, the cool thing about having that adjustable radius is it's actually possible to adjust this thing's run speed later down the road if I want it to take bigger steps. Now, there is, it turns, it walks and turns. The head and tail are filled with metal. They're basically just counterweight. But then my favorite part is, of course, as you saw earlier, my idea with the controls was working on having an actual run animation. And yes, it works. So we just toggle 1. And it starts running. We toggle 1 again, it puts the brakes on, and returns to walking. Toggle 1. And it'll turn while running. It's a larger turn, obviously. And then when we come to a stop, and we'll hit backwards for a second, and that just kind of, because it goes into the step, and for whatever reason, unless you have it on 360, the controller won't recenter. So you have to hit backwards, and then it settles back out. There's some wiring going on in here. So this controller up here is actually handling the radius increase on the cranks up here. And then one controller runs one speed, that's a basic double bearing, and then they're cranked to each other. So both legs is powered by the same controller on one of these 2 bearings. Then the walking, whether you're starting or stopping, is done by those 2 bearings. And then the offset is controlled by these 2 bearings. So one offset is put in by one controller for walking, and then overridden by the other controller for running. Alright, so anyways, so for today's little build thing, just gonna finish this out aesthetically, and then that of course is gonna require me to keep polishing everything for balance. That's use of these shocks and adding and removing metal in the head and tail to keep everything balanced, because if it's too tail heavy, it'll start to kind of skip on the back legs. If it's too head heavy, then it won't actually propel itself forward. It'll just step in place. And then once everything is done aesthetically, then it's time to take it to something with hills and terrain and see if the wolf or fox or whatever weird four-legged thing this turns out actually looking like can do in rougher terrain. So, back in a minute.
Next level. Next level.
right, well, that was a lot more time consuming than I thought it was gonna be. And then I realized I forgot to paint my bearings, so I had to use the blueprint painter thingamabobber to actually go back because I wasn't gonna disassemble everything and do the bearings. So now we have the finished product. And yeah, I think that works. Couple adjustments, obviously I gave it a moving jaw, and then I also gave it a wag animation, sorta. All right, so now we have terrain that we can work with. So we're gonna start with some nice subtle terrain here and just see how it handles little inclines and things, because I suspect that as long as we keep it like longitudinal trying to go over hills and things, it's not gonna have too many issues. But once we try and take it to where it's leaning on its side, that's when it's gonna have issues. It looks like it's just prowling through the woods looking for its next meal. So here we got a little bit of offset hill. I completely suspect this thing to just roll to its right. And I would have been wrong. It's trying to figure out steering. You gotta undershoot or overshoot your corners. Undershoot. Alright, well, let's put it to a run. And run into a tree almost immediately. Let's run over this hill here. Oh, this is where it's gonna roll. It's gotta roll, right? There's no way it stays stable through all this. Or it will handle it just fine. Now it's gonna roll. Has to roll. No? Wow. Well, yep, we finally found what would cause it to roll. So it's rolled twice so far, just trying to get to this point. It's interesting. But now we have the hill climb. Now, in walk mode, I actually have no problem saying this thing's gonna make it up a hill. Turning might be another thing. Well, there it goes. Because at least in walk mode, there's always one front, one rear leg in contact with the ground. So turning's not a problem. But in run mode, you don't... See, I'm almost immediately... we made it. We can make it around this tree. It's actually struggling to get grip. Because of course it weighs a lot, because I had to use a lot of metal in this to get it to balance out properly. Because at this point I've probably cut it out, but you would have seen in the intro that I did a lot of attempts at beauty shots. Come on, work your way around the thing. Can I? There we go. Come on. There we go. Well, can I jump? What happens if we just walk it off a cliff? We gotta find out. What happens if it can't make it? Oh, there it goes. Set the feet back to stable. Oh my lord. Now, of course, I have no backwards, so I'm not getting out of this. Or I'm gonna be able to just... Yeah, I'm not even gonna pretend to understand how I did that. So it looks like it's getting belly rubs right now, and it's kind of happy about that. Alright, so finally completed a walker that doesn't take up all my frames. Quite happy with this one. I think I'm actually gonna throw this one up on the workshop. So, hope you liked it. If not, there's buttons for that. If you did, there's buttons for that. And as always, buttons to push. Until next time.